chapter 17 and 18. You recall when we started out our discussion of Revelation a couple months ago, we talked about how there were four interpretations, four basic interpretations of Revelation, and one of them was called preterist. And what the idea of the preterist was is that it's a view that Revelation is primarily about events that took place in John's day. So it's not really about the future, it's not about Napoleon or Hitler or any of that. It's all about stuff that took place in John's day. And I think some of you were kind of didn't even understand that point of view. Well, if you have that point of view, if you're of a preterist interpretation, this is your day. Because chapter 17 and 18, I think, are clearly preterist chapters. So while I don't think that's what all of Revelation is about, I do think there are a couple chapters in Revelation which are about events of John's time. And that's what we'll start out with today, 17 and 18. And then hopefully we'll have time to get to 19 where we discuss the second coming of Christ, which is really kind of the punchline in Revelation. That's what it's all about. But we'll do 17 and 18 first. So first off, chapter 17 and 18 describes the fate of Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes, and the abominations of the earth. Now, of course, we could interpret that in many ways. You might think it's referring to one of your relatives, for example. That was a joke. In-laws. I should have said in-laws. Then you would have got the joke. You might think it's referring to one of your in-laws, for example. But over time, in interpretation of the book of Revelation, that's traditionally been viewed that that's probably talking about Rome. And it makes perfect sense that John would have a couple nasty chapters in Revelation about the Romans. Because remember, Revelation is written late, it's probably in the early 90s, the mid 90s. The church has already been through a couple rounds of persecution from Roman emperors. You had Nero, and you had his crazy uncle Claudius, you had Diocletian, Decius, and they have launched pogroms against the Christians. So it makes perfect sense that somewhere in Revelation you would find some anger directed against the Romans, who of course were preventing Christianity from being spread any way they could. Now, in retrospect, we probably don't want to be too hard on the Romans, because after all, the fact that there's 2 billion Christians today is because Constantine, who was the emperor of the Roman Empire, made Christianity the official religion of the empire. But that wasn't going to happen for another 200 some years. So back at this point, Christianity was a persecuted religion, and it was persecuted by the Romans. And we'll see the proof for that interpretation that this is about the Romans in a moment. In fact, this is the next bullet. I knew that because I spent hours and hours going over the material before every class, and I knew that that was the next bullet.
The fact that you just taught this at 9 o'clock, just kind of...
No, actually, we're a week behind in the 9 o'clock course. So I taught what I taught last week in this week. So the reference is probably to Rome because verse 9 of chapter 17 refers to the 7 hills on which the Babylon the Great sits. So Rome is built on 7 hills, and it seems reasonable to assume that Babylon the Great is the Roman Empire, rather than referring to maybe a specific person. And as we already said, it makes sense that somewhere in Revelation, John would vent his frustration with the Romans. And as a matter of fact, it's possible that John even thought that the persecutions of Christians by the Roman empires were part of the tribulation. I mean, John might have felt the tribulation had already started because Christians were being persecuted so much. So it makes perfect sense. We could also mention that the metaphor business. When John uses the metaphor of the Romans as the most evil thing he could think of, it's the same way that today we might use Osama bin Laden, or we might use use Pol Pot or Hitler or Stalin or Mao. So when you're reaching for a metaphor of the most horrible thing you can imagine, you're probably going to use something from your day, from your era. Another way of looking at chapter 17 and 18 is that John is using the Roman Empire as a metaphor for Satan, or a metaphor for evil. And remember, Nero tacked Christians up on crosses along beside the Appian Way, put pitch on them and lit them on fire. So it makes perfect sense that John would view the Romans as evil incarnate living.
This Bible study I've been doing, we're reading Isaiah and Ezekiel, the kings and all that together. And I mean, the Babylonian, the Assyrians back then, I mean, they used, it's astounding when you see some of the scripture of how much it looks like stuff you see in Revelations with, you know, the way that they talk about the woman in labor and just the horror of Babylon. I mean, it's all in the Old Testament too, so it's really interesting how especially the Israelites have had this historical figure of, you know, the ultimate evil or whatever, and it's associated with, you know, what's going on, you know, like you said, at the time of, you know, the history.
And there's this wonderful medieval engraving showing the horror of Babylon riding on this creature with multiple heads, which I just thought was wonderful. And you see these people bowing down to it. This was the wonderful thing about medieval art and medieval engravings is they were so literal. So the horror of Babylon riding on this horse with multiple heads, and so that's what they drew, a horse with multiple